polished mahogany table felt like a vast, empty continent between Ethan and the people who were supposed to be his family. Aveline, the restaurant he had chosen for his 35th birthday, was a symphony of hushed elegance. Crystal glasses shimmered under amber light. The air was thick with the scent of truffle oil and quiet ambition, and the low murmur of conversation from other tables provided a soundtrack of sophisticated contentment. It was a place designed for celebration, for momentous occasions. Yet at the head of his own table, Ethan felt less like the guest of honor and more like a specimen under a microscope. His father-in-law, Richard Vance, swirled a deep red liquid in a comically large glass, the gesture a practiced display of connoisseurship. "You know, Ethan," Richard began, his voice carrying the easy, booming authority of a man who had never been told no. "I have to hand it to you. This place is impressive. Must have cost you a pretty penny." He didn't look at Ethan when he said it. His gaze was fixed on the wine, as if Ethan were merely a peripheral character in the drama of the vintage. "Happy to do it, Richard," Ethan replied, his voice calm and even. He met the gaze of his wife, Chloe, who offered a weak, fleeting smile from across the table. Her eyes, usually so vibrant, were clouded with a familiar anxiety. "Oh, we know you are," chimed in Eleanor, Richard's wife and Chloe's mother. She was a woman sculpted from disapproval, her posture ramrod straight, her pearls cinched tight against her throat, as if to keep any genuine emotion from escaping. "But we do worry. An architect's salary, well, it's respectable, I suppose, for what it is. But this," she gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings, at the waiter who refilled their water glasses with silent, ghost-like efficiency. "This is a different league. One has to be careful not to play in a league one cannot afford." The insult, wrapped in the delicate tissue of feigned concern, landed on the table with a silent thud. Ethan felt it, a small, cold stone in his gut. It wasn't the first, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. For 5 years, ever since he had married Chloe, he had been the family project, the fixer-upper they despaired of ever improving. Brendan, Chloe's younger brother, snorted into his napkin. He was a younger, cruder version of his father, all the arrogance with none of the polish. "Mom's right, Ethan. Don't get me wrong, we appreciate the gesture. It's a nice birthday party for yourself, but you've got to live within your means. You don't want to end up like one of those people who flashes a bit of cash and is broke by Tuesday. It's just not a good look." He leaned forward, his expression a parody of brotherly advice. "I could set you up with my financial guy. He could teach you a thing or two about managing a modest portfolio." Broke. The word hung in the air, shimmering with malice. They thought he was putting on a show, stretching himself thin to impress them. They saw his calm demeanor as weakness, his choice of a quiet, methodical profession as a lack of ambition. They saw his worn but comfortable jacket and his 10-year-old watch and drew their conclusions, scribbling him into a ledger of mediocrity. They thought this dinner was a desperate, foolish splurge, an act of financial self-harm. They didn't know that the bill for this meal, for every meal eaten in this room tonight, would ultimately be a rounding error on a balance sheet he reviewed every morning. They didn't know that when he paid, the money simply moved from one of his accounts to another. They didn't know that he didn't just pay the bill here. He was the bill. He owned Aveline. He owned the building it was in. He owned the entire block. They were sitting in his world, judging him for the price of admission. Ethan took a slow, deliberate sip of water, the cool liquid a small anchor in the rising tide of their condescension. He looked at their confident, dismissive faces and felt not anger, but a profound and weary sense of clarity. Within 2 hours, their entire world would be upended. They just didn't know it yet. "Thank you for being here for the beginning of this story. I can see from the comments on my last video that so many of you connect with these moments of being underestimated. If you've ever felt that way, go ahead and hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because you are not going to want to miss how this evening unfolds. Trust me, the main course hasn't even been served yet. The humiliation had not begun with the wine, of course. It had begun years ago, a slow drip of condescension that had eroded the banks of Ethan's patience. He remembered the first time he'd met Richard and Eleanor, in their sprawling, sterile mansion that felt more like a corporate headquarters than a home. He had arrived with Chloe, holding a bouquet of lilies, her favorite. Eleanor had accepted them with a tight smile, handing them off to a housekeeper without a second glance, as if he'd handed her a handful of weeds. Throughout that first dinner, Richard had interrogated him about his prospects. Architecture, Richard had mused, was a noble but soft profession. The real money, the real power, he declared, is in building empires, not buildings. The implication was clear. Ethan was a laborer, a glorified draftsman, while men like Richard were visionaries, kings. Ethan had tried to explain the complexities of his work, the fusion of art and engineering, the billion-dollar public infrastructure projects he was consulting on. But Richard's eyes had glazed over. The details were irrelevant. The only metric he understood was the one on a bank statement, and he had already decided what Ethan's must look like. Now, seated in Aveline, Ethan watched the same dynamic play out. The appetizers arrived, a delicate mosaic of seared scallops, saffron risotto cakes, and prosciutto-wrapped figs. They were works of art, each plate a testament to the chef's meticulous skill. His chef's skill. "My goodness," Eleanor said, prodding a scallop with her fork, as if testing it for poison. "It all seems a bit fussy, doesn't it? What happened to a good, honest steak?" "This is what passes for fine dining these days, Mother," Brendan explained, already halfway through his risotto cake. "It's about the experience, not the sustenance. All style, no substance." "A bit like modern architecture, eh, Ethan?" He winked, a greasy, conspiratorial gesture. Ethan simply smiled. "I find the substance is usually there if you know where to look for it, Brendan." He picked up his fork and took a bite of the scallop. It was perfect. The sear was crisp, the inside translucent and sweet, the saffron-infused oil a whisper of exotic warmth. He had personally approved the dish during a tasting 2 months ago. He made a mental note to congratulate Chef Dubois later. He felt a light pressure on his knee under the table. Chloe. He glanced at her. Her face was a mask of strained nonchalance, but her eyes were pleading with him. "Don't rise to it. Please, not tonight." He gave her knee a reassuring squeeze, a silent promise that he would keep the peace. For her. For now. He knew this was harder for her than it was for him. She was caught in the middle, torn between the man she loved and the family who had defined her world. She saw their flaws. He knew she did. But she was bound to them by a complex web of love, duty, and lifelong conditioning. She had spent her entire life trying to win their approval, an approval they dispensed as sparingly as a miser parts with gold. When she brought Ethan home, she had hoped he would be her victory, the man whose quiet strength and intelligence would finally impress them. Instead, they had simply seen him as another one of her failures to meet their impossible standards. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and his fingers brushed against the smooth, worn leather of his notebook. It was a simple, black moleskin, its pages filled with his neat, angular handwriting. It was his real ledger. In it were not financial figures but ideas, sketches, observations. Designs for buildings that would reshape skylines, but also notes on conversations, lists of books to read, drafts of letters. It was a map of his inner world, a world the Vances had no idea existed. Tucked into the back pocket was a folded-up document, the title deed for the commercial property at 1422 Elm Street, the very building they were sitting in. The notebook was his symbolic object, a tangible representation of the vast, hidden depths they could not see. Touching it was a small act of self-reassurance, a reminder of the reality that existed beyond their narrow perceptions. He was not the man they saw. He was the architect of his own life, and tonight he would finally show them the blueprints. The conversation had moved on, with Richard now holding court about a recent golf trip to Pebble Beach. He spoke of greens fees that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and complained about the quality of the sand in one of the bunkers, as if it were a matter of global importance. Ethan let the words wash over him. He was practicing a technique he had learned long ago, detaching from the immediate emotional sting and observing the situation as a designer would. He was assessing the structural integrity of the relationships at this table. He saw the cracks, the stress fractures, the faulty foundations. Richard's bluster was a load-bearing wall of insecurity. Eleanor's snobbery was a facade to cover a deep-seated fear of irrelevance. Brendan's cruelty was the desperate overcompensation of a man who knew, deep down, that he had achieved nothing on his own. And Chloe was the keystone, the piece that held the unstable arch together. But a keystone is also the piece that bears the most weight, and he could see it was beginning to crush her. Her smile was brittle, her laughter a fraction too loud. Every time her family directed a barb at him, a flicker of pain crossed her face before she could hide it. She was defending him in her heart, but her voice was silent. This silence, more than any of her family's insults, was what truly wounded him. It was a silent enabling that gave them permission to continue. He knew that for their marriage to have a future, that silence had to be broken. Tonight, he would not just reveal his wealth, he would force a choice. He would see if the woman he loved was willing to build a new life with him, on a foundation of mutual respect, or if she would remain a prisoner in the crumbling edifice of her family's expectations. The main courses arrived. A roasted duck for Richard and Brendan, a pan-seared sea bass for Eleanor, and a filet mignon for Chloe. For Ethan, the waiter placed down a plate of hand-rolled pappardelle with a wild boar ragout. It was his favorite dish, a rustic, hearty meal that stood in stark contrast to the more delicate fare on the table. "Oh, Ethan," Eleanor said, wrinkling her nose slightly. "Pasta? It's a bit pedestrian for a place like this, isn't it?" "It's what he wanted for his birthday, Mother," Chloe said, her voice tight. It was the first time she had spoken in his defense, however small, and Ethan felt a flicker of warmth. Richard chuckled. "Let the man have his pasta, Eleanor. It's a comforting meal, probably reminds him of his student days." He took a large bite of duck, chewing with theatrical relish. You have to enjoy the simple things when that's what you can afford. Ethan picked up his fork and knife. He looked at the rich, dark ragout, smelled the fragrant rosemary and thyme. He looked at Richard, at Eleanor, at Brendan. He saw their smug, self-satisfied faces, so certain in their judgment, so blind in their arrogance. And then he looked at Chloe and saw the tears glistening in her eyes. It was time. The slow burn was over. It was time to light the fuse. He met her gaze and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture that said, "I'm okay, I'm in control, and I'm sorry, but this ends now." He turned his attention back to his meal, a picture of perfect calm. The quiet before the storm had begun. Brendan, never one to let an opportunity for cruelty pass, decided to escalate. He had just closed a minor deal, a small commercial lease renewal for a property his father owned, and he was puffed up with self-importance. He saw Ethan's quiet professionalism not as a virtue, but as a pitiable lack of killer instinct. "So, Ethan," Brendan began, wiping a smear of duck fat from his lips with the back of his hand, before seeming to remember the linen napkin in his lap. "How's the building drawing business? Still stacking bricks on paper? I was just telling Dad the market is ruthless right now. You gotta be aggressive. You gotta be a shark." He leaned back, patting his stomach. Me, I just closed a deal that's going to net me a nice little bonus. Enough to say, buy a new car. A German one. Ethan continued to eat his pasta, chewing slowly and methodically. Congratulations, Brendan. That's great news. His response was devoid of sarcasm, a flat plane of politeness that gave Brendan's ego nothing to cling to. This placid reaction seemed to infuriate Brendan more than any argument could have. Great news? That's all you have to say? See, this is your problem, Ethan. You lack passion. You lack hunger. You're content to just draft, while the rest of us are out there hunting. Brendan, stop it, Chloe whispered, her voice a strained plea. She shot a desperate look at her father, who merely shrugged, a silent signal that he endorsed the blood sport. No, let him speak, Chloe, Ethan said, finally setting his fork down. He placed his hands on the table, palms down, a gesture of quiet finality. I'm interested to hear Brendan's philosophy on hunting. Brendan, emboldened, took the stage. It's a jungle out there, man. You eat or you get eaten. You can't be sitting around waiting for some city council to approve a permit for a library. You have to go out and take what's yours. You have to have assets that work for you. Real estate, stocks, things that generate wealth while you sleep. Not blueprints. He said the word blueprints as if it were a particularly nasty piece of refuse. I see, Ethan said. His voice was still quiet, but a new quality had entered it, a sharp, metallic edge. And what assets do you have that work for you, Brendan? Brendan was momentarily taken aback. What? I have my portfolio. The properties Dad has me manage. So they're your father's assets, Ethan stated, not as a question but as a fact. Assets he asks you to manage. Is that a fair summary? The theatrical naturalism of the conversation was shifting. It was becoming a cross-examination. Richard bristled. Now see here, Ethan. My son is a sharp businessman. He's learning the ropes. I have no doubt, Ethan said, turning his calm, unwavering gaze to his father-in-law. He has an excellent teacher in the art of leveraging other people's capital. The subtext was so thick it was practically another guest at the table. Chloe's hand flew to her mouth. Eleanor looked from her husband to her son, a confused frown on her face, sensing the shift in power, but not understanding its source. Brendan, however, was not that subtle. Are you insulting me? He sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. Are you insulting my father? I'm clarifying your business philosophy, Ethan replied smoothly. You believe in being a shark, a hunter, but it seems to me you're hunting in a nature preserve, stocked and managed by your father. The prey is tied to a post. It's not a hunt, Brendan. It's a feeding. The silence that followed was stunning. The quiet bomb had been deployed, a small one, a precursor to the main event. Brendan was speechless, his jaw working silently. He had walked directly into Ethan's verbal trap, his own arrogance leading him to the slaughter. It was in this moment that Chloe's failure was most acute. This was her chance. Her brother had been publicly and masterfully dismantled. Her father was momentarily silenced. This was the moment for her to align with her husband, to say, "He's right, Brendan. You've been cruel and disrespectful all night." Instead, she defaulted to her role as peacemaker. "Okay, that's enough," she said, her voice high and trembling. "Both of you. This is Ethan's birthday. Can we please just try to have a nice evening?" She looked at Ethan, and her eyes weren't pleading for his sake anymore. They were pleading for her own, for a return to the uncomfortable but familiar status quo. She wasn't choosing him. She was choosing peace at any price. And the price was his dignity. He saw it all in that instant. He had given her the opening, and she had closed it. The disappointment was a physical blow, sharper than any of Brendan's clumsy insults. He had been so focused on the Vance's blindness that he hadn't wanted to see his own wife's. She didn't see his strength either. She just saw a conflict she wanted to avoid. He picked up his fork again, but not to eat. He tapped it once, a quiet, metallic sound against the rim of his plate. Ting! The sound cut through the tension. "You're right, Chloe," he said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "It is my birthday, and I believe it's time for dessert. And the bill." He looked past his family, his gaze sweeping across the dining room he owned, and caught the eye of his manager, Marcus, who was standing discreetly by the service station. Ethan gave a short, sharp nod. Marcus nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the signal they had prearranged. The final act was about to begin. The humiliation was complete. The preparation was over. It was time for the reversal. The desserts arrived, but no one seemed to have an appetite. A palpable tension had settled over the table, as thick and cloying as the chocolate lava cake that sat untouched before Brendan. The earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, resentful silence. Richard stared into the dregs of his wine. Eleanor fussed with her napkin, folding and unfolding it into sharp, anxious creases. Brendan poked at his cake, mutilating it into a brown, gooey mess. Only Ethan seemed at ease, sipping his coffee, his expression unreadable. Chloe kept darting nervous glances at him, a silent catechism of worry in her eyes. What had that nod to the manager meant? What was he planning? Her peacemaking attempt had failed spectacularly, creating a silence more menacing than the argument it had replaced. She had tried to smooth the ruffled feathers, but had only succeeded in plucking the bird bare. She felt a growing dread, a sense that they were all perched on the edge of a cliff, and Ethan was about to give them a gentle push. The waiter, a young man with impeccably trained neutrality, approached the table. "Will there be anything else this evening?" "Just the bill, thank you," Ethan said calmly. Richard straightened up, seizing the opportunity to reassert his dominance. This was a ritual he understood. The paying of the check was the final act of power in any social engagement. "Nonsense, Ethan. It's your birthday. I'll take care of it. Put it on my card." He started to pull a black American Express card from his wallet, a slab of polished metal he wielded like a scepter. "That's very generous of you, Richard," Ethan said, his voice polite but firm. "But that won't be necessary." "Don't be silly," Richard boomed, waving the card. "I insist. After all, a meal like this, it's an indulgence. Let me indulge you." The condescension was back full force. He was offering to pay not as a gift, but as a form of charity, a public demonstration of Ethan's financial inferiority. "I appreciate the offer," Ethan repeated, his gaze steady, "but I can't let you do that." "Why not?" Brendan sneered, finally looking up from his desecrated dessert. "Afraid your card will be declined? Don't worry, Dad's got a high enough limit to cover your little party." This was it. The final, gratuitous insult. The last stone thrown before the avalanche. Ethan felt a profound sense of calm settle over him. It was the calm of an architect who has reviewed the final stress test results and knows the structure will hold. He had designed this moment, and it was unfolding exactly as planned. He turned slightly in his chair, away from his family, and looked towards the front of the restaurant. As if on cue, Marcus, the manager, was approaching the table. He was a tall, distinguished man in a perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair lending him an air of quiet authority. He held a leather-bound bill folder in his hand. Marcus did not approach Richard, who was still holding his credit card aloft like a sad, impotent trophy. He did not approach the center of the table. He walked directly to Ethan's side. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus said, his voice a low, respectful baritone. He inclined his head slightly. "Will you be closing out your own tab this evening, or shall I add it to the monthly house account?" The silence at the table was no longer just tense. It was absolute. It was a vacuum. Richard's hand holding the credit card froze in midair. Eleanor's mouth opened slightly. Brendan's fork clattered onto his plate. Chloe stared, her eyes wide with utter confusion. Mr. Thorne? House account? The words made no sense. It was like hearing a foreign language she almost understood. Ethan didn't look at them. He kept his attention focused on Marcus, the two of them creating a small, private bubble of command in the middle of the public drama. Just close it out for tonight, Marcus, Ethan said quietly. We'll need a record of the evening's expenses for the quarterly review. Of course, sir, Marcus replied. He opened the leather folder and presented it not to Ethan, but placed it gently on the table next to Ethan's hand. And Chef Dubois asked me to pass along his thanks for your notes on the winter menu. The adjustments to the venison dish have been a remarkable success. Ethan nodded. Give him my compliments on the scallops. They were perfect tonight. I will do that, sir. Marcus paused, his professional gaze sweeping over the other people at the table for the first time, his expression a perfect blank. Was everything to your satisfaction this evening? The question was a standard piece of restaurant script, but in this context it landed with the force of a formal inquiry. Was everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Thorne? Did your guests behave? Ethan finally turned to look at his family. He looked at Richard's stunned face, the black card still clutched in his hand. He looked at Eleanor's horrified expression, the dawning realization of a massive social blunder. He looked at Brendan's slack-jawed disbelief. And finally, he looked at his wife, Chloe, whose face was a kaleidoscope of confusion, shock, and a tiny, emerging flicker of awe. He picked up the leather folder. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He tapped it lightly against the table. Everything, he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of an earthquake, is about to be. The quiet before the storm was over. The storm had just made landfall. The air at the table crackled, thick with unspoken questions. Richard was the first to find his voice, though it had lost its usual booming confidence. It was thin, reedy. What is this? What's going on, Ethan? He gestured towards Marcus with his chin. Who is this man? This is Marcus, Ethan said simply, his tone patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. He's the general manager of Aveline. I can see that, Richard snapped, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. Why is he talking to you like that, Mr. Thorne? House account? What kind of joke is this? It's not a joke, Richard, Ethan said. He still hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet words were dismantling their reality, brick by brick. He looked at Marcus. Marcus, would you mind waiting for me in my office? I'll be there in a few minutes to sign the nightly reports. The word my landed with surgical precision. My office. Of course, Mr. Thorne, Marcus said with another slight bow of his head. He turned and walked away, his departure leaving a profound void. The family was now alone with Ethan, and the protective layer of public decorum had been stripped away. Your office? Chloe whispered, the words barely audible. She was looking at him as if for the first time. The man she thought she knew, the steady, reliable, slightly unambitious architect, was dissolving before her eyes, and a stranger was taking his place. Ethan finally turned his full attention to them. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table, the posture of a man about to lead a board meeting. I suppose some clarification is in order, he began. The theatricality was gone. This was pure, unadulterated fact. Brendan, you were talking about assets, things that generate wealth while you sleep. You seem to think I didn't understand the concept. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Aveline is one of those assets. Brendan stared blankly. What do you mean, you have shares? You're an investor? Ethan gave a small, almost pitying shake of his head. No, Brendan, I'm not an investor in the restaurant. I am the restaurant. I am the sole proprietor of Thorne Hospitality Group, the parent company that owns and operates Aveline and 2 other establishments in the city. A glass of water slipped from Eleanor's hand, tipping over and sending a wave of ice-cold water across the mahogany table. No one moved to clean it up. The spreading pool was a physical manifestation of their dissolving certainty. That's not possible, Richard stammered. You're an architect. I am an architect, Ethan confirmed. A very successful one. My consulting firm, Thorn Design and Strategy, handles large-scale urban infrastructure planning. It's quite lucrative. It allowed me to diversify my portfolio about 10 years ago. I started with property, small at first, then larger. I found I had a talent for seeing potential in underutilized commercial spaces. He gestured around the opulent dining room. This building, for example, the entire block actually, 1422 Elm Street. It was a derelict warehouse when I bought it 7 years ago. The city council you so disdain, Brendan, had zoned it for redevelopment. I knew the new transit line was going to have a stop 2 blocks away. I saw the potential. So I acquired the property. I redesigned it myself. I oversaw the construction. And then I decided to open a restaurant on the ground floor to act as an anchor tenant. I thought it would be an interesting challenge. He picked up the black moleskin notebook from the table beside him and opened it. He flattened a page that showed a detailed architectural sketch of the very room they were in, with notes in the margin about acoustics and lighting. I designed this room. I chose the wood for this table. I approved the fabric for these chairs. I hired Chef Dubois from a 3-star Michelin restaurant in Lyon. I interviewed Marcus personally. He looked directly at Richard. You were right, Richard. This place is a different league. Then his gaze shifted to Eleanor. And you were right, Eleanor. One has to be careful not to play in a league one cannot afford. He let the words hang in the air, their own insults now turned back on them, perfectly inverted. He closed the notebook with a soft snap. You called me broke. You patronized me. You ridiculed my profession and my perceived lack of ambition. You did all of this while sitting in my restaurant, eating my food, and drinking my wine. You weren't just guests in my home, so to speak. You were components in my revenue stream. He finally looked at Chloe. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with a storm of emotions. Shock, hurt, confusion, and something else, a dawning, terrifying respect. He had not just revealed a secret, he had redrawn the entire map of their lives. The quiet, humble man she had been apologizing for and protecting was, it turned out, the most powerful person she had ever known. And he had never felt the need to tell her. The weight of that omission was, in its own way, as devastating as her family's insults. The reversal of fortune was complete. The king they had mocked had just revealed his kingdom. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of silent shock. The Vance family, a unit built on the solid bedrock of their own perceived superiority, had just witnessed that bedrock turn to sand. Richard, the patriarch, the titan of industry, looked small. The black credit card lay abandoned on the table beside the water puddle, a useless relic of a power that was no longer valid. He seemed to have aged a decade in the last 10 minutes, his face a mask of gray disbelief. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the wellspring of his booming pronouncements having run dry. Eleanor was the first to react, her instincts for social survival kicking in, however clumsily. Ethan, she said, her voice a high, brittle thing. We had no idea. You must understand, if we had known, she trailed off, the unspoken end of the sentence hanging in the air. We would have treated you differently. It was meant as an apology, but it was the most damning confession of all. It was an admission that their respect was not for him as a person, but for his net worth. Ethan's expression didn't soften. That's the point, Eleanor. You shouldn't have had to know. The simple truth of the statement was like a slap. Brendan, meanwhile, was processing the information not in social terms, but in financial ones. His mind was racing, recalibrating. The man he had been calling broke was not just solvent, He was in a completely different stratosphere. The implications were beginning to dawn on him. Thorn Hospitality Group? He said, the name tasting foreign in his mouth. And Thorn Design and Strategy? He was connecting dots, and he didn't like the picture they were forming. He remembered a conversation a few weeks ago about a new downtown development project he was hoping to get his father to invest in. The primary consultant on that project, the name had been Thorn, he had dismissed it as a coincidence. The Elm Street block, Brendan muttered, mostly to himself. That's adjacent to the new waterfront development, the one everyone is trying to get a piece of. It is, Ethan confirmed, his voice flat. He knew exactly where Brendan's mind was going. The shark was smelling blood in the water, only to realize he was in a tank with a great white. But Ethan's focus was not on them. It was on his wife. Chloe had not said a word. She was staring at the spilled water on the table, watching it soak into the fine grain of the wood Ethan had chosen. Every detail of the room was now a testament to a life he had lived completely separate from her. A universe of success and power he had hidden, not just from her family, but from her. The betrayal she felt from her family was now competing with a new, more complex betrayal from her husband. "Why?" she finally whispered, looking up at him. Her eyes were swimming with tears, but her voice was steady. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" It was the most important question of the night. It was the question that would determine the future of their marriage. Ethan's gaze softened as he looked at her. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His touch was gentle. "I fell in love with a woman named Chloe Vance, not the daughter of Richard Vance," he said, his voice dropping so that only she could hear. "I wanted to build a life with you, Chloe. Just us, on our own terms. I wanted to be sure that you were with me, Ethan Thorne, the architect, not Ethan Thorne, the property magnate. I wanted to be sure it was real." He paused, his thumb tracing a circle on the back of her hand. "I needed to know if we could build something that would stand on its own, without a billion-dollar foundation. I guess I was stress-testing our marriage." He looked around the table at her family, then back at her. "And tonight, I got the results." The words were both a loving explanation and a terrible indictment. He had been testing her, and in her desperate attempts to keep the peace, to manage her family's toxicity instead of confronting it, she had failed. She had chosen to be the silent enabler. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She pulled her hand back from his as if burned. The spell was broken. Richard cleared his throat, finding a sliver of his old authority. "All right, Ethan, you've made your point. A bit theatrical for my taste, but point made. You're a wealthy man. Congratulations." He was trying to frame it as a game that was now over. "Now, I think apologies are in order. From my family to you." He shot a hard look at Brendan and Eleanor. But Ethan wasn't looking at him. He was still looking at Chloe, his expression one of deep, profound disappointment. The financial revelation was over. The emotional one was just beginning. The Vances thought this was about money. Ethan knew it had always been about respect. And the person whose respect he had wanted most had just failed to give it. The car ride home for the Vances would be a masterclass in silent fury. Richard would grip the steering wheel of his Mercedes, his knuckles white, the city lights flashing across his stony face. Eleanor would sit in the passenger seat, staring out the window, replaying every condescending remark she had made over the past 5 years, each one now a tiny, sharp shard of humiliation. In the back, Brendan would be furiously typing on his phone, his initial shock giving way to a frantic, greedy curiosity. He wasn't feeling remorse. He was calculating. Thorn Hospitality Group, Thorn Design and Strategy. How could he leverage this? How could this new reality benefit him? The lesson of humility was utterly lost on him. He was only learning to identify a more powerful predator. "I can't believe it," Eleanor would finally whisper into the tense silence. The sheer arrogance of it, letting us go on like that. The arrogance wasn't his, Eleanor, Richard would bite back, his voice rough. It was ours. We walked into his house and called him a peasant. The admission was gravel in his throat. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Vance had been fundamentally, unequivocally put in his place. And what was worse, he had been put in his place by a man he had dismissed as a nobody. The core of his identity, his unerring judgment of men and markets, had been proven catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, back at Aveline, the staff cleared the table with their usual quiet efficiency. The spilled water was wiped away, the dessert plates removed. To any outside observer, it was just another table finishing their meal. But for Chloe and Ethan, it was the site of a demolition. Chloe finally stood up, her movements stiff. I need some air. She walked away from the table, past the other diners who were oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded, and pushed through the heavy doors out into the cool night. Ethan watched her go. He paid the bill, a formality, a transfer from one of his own accounts to another, and then walked to his office at the back of the restaurant. Marcus was waiting for him, holding a slim folder. A difficult evening, sir? Marcus asked, his expression carefully neutral. A necessary one, Marcus, Ethan replied, taking the folder and signing the documents inside with a steady hand. Thank you for your part in it. It is always my pleasure to be of service, Mr. Thorne, Marcus said. He was the perfect employee, loyal, discreet, and fully aware of who paid his salary. Ethan walked out of the office and through the bustling kitchen, a world of controlled chaos, fire, and steam. The smells of garlic, roasting meat, and simmering stocks filled the air. Chef Dubois, a large man with a fierce expression and passionate eyes, saw him and gave a sharp nod. The scallops? They were good? Perfect, Antoine. As always, Ethan said. He pushed through the back door into the alley behind the restaurant. The air was cool and smelled of rain and garbage, a stark contrast to the perfumed elegance of the dining room. Chloe was standing there, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering slightly. She turned as he approached. The anger and shock on her face had been replaced by a deep, hollow sadness. For 5 years, Ethan, she said, her voice trembling. For 5 years I have been fighting a battle for you, in my head, with my family, defending you, justifying you, trying to make them see you the way I do. And how is it you see me, Chloe? He asked, his voice gentle. I see a good man. A kind, brilliant, patient man who loves me, she cried, tears starting to stream down her cheeks. But I also saw a man who needed protecting, a man whose feelings I had to shield from my awful family. I thought I was your ally, your partner in this, but I wasn't. I was just another person who underestimated you. The truth of her own words hit her. And you let me. You let me believe you were less. You let me twist myself into knots, feeling guilty and ashamed, when all along you were holding all the cards. You didn't trust me. That's not true, he said, stepping closer. I trust you with my life, Chloe. I just didn't trust the Vances. I didn't trust their influence. I had to know if what we had was strong enough to survive them. I built this life for us. He swept his hand back towards the restaurant, towards the city skyline. But I wanted you to choose me first. Choose you? She asked, a note of hysteria entering her voice. I did choose you. I chose you over their objections, over their snide remarks, over their constant pressure to marry someone more suitable. I married you, Ethan. What more of a choice did you need? I needed you to stand with me tonight, he said, his voice finally showing a fissure of the hurt he had been suppressing. When your brother called me a failure, I needed you to say, he is not. When your father offered to pay for my birthday dinner like I was a charity case, I needed you to say, he doesn't need your money. I needed you to be my wife, not their daughter. The accusation hung in the alley between them, more powerful than any revelation of wealth. This was the true consequence of the evening. The foundation of their marriage was now exposed, and they both had to decide if it was worth repairing. The Vances had been humbled, but in the process, Ethan and Chloe's relationship had been pushed to the brink. The power dynamic had shifted, but now a chasm of secrets and unspoken resentments had opened between them. The days that followed were a landscape of strained silence. Ethan and Chloe coexisted in their beautiful, minimalist apartment, a space Ethan had also designed, like polite, wary ghosts. The easy intimacy they had once shared was gone, replaced by a careful, hesitant distance. The trust had been fractured, not just by her family's cruelty, but by his secrets. Chloe felt as though she was married to a stranger, a man who had been playing a long, elaborate game in which she was an unwitting piece. Her family, in a stunning reversal, began a campaign of supplication. The phone calls started the very next day. Eleanor called first, her voice dripping with a syrupy, unfamiliar sweetness. She gushed about the restaurant, about Ethan's brilliance, about how they must all get together again soon. Properly this time. Chloe listened, her stomach turning. It was so transparent, so transactional. They didn't respect Ethan, they respected his money. Richard's approach was more direct. He called Ethan, man to man, as he put it. It was a rambling, awkward apology that was less about expressing remorse and more about probing the extent of Ethan's empire. He mentioned the waterfront development, casually dropping hints about potential synergies and partnerships. Your boy Brendan has some good instincts on that one, Richard had said, a desperate attempt to rehabilitate his son's image. Ethan had listened patiently before politely but firmly shutting him down. My business and my family are two separate things, Richard. I intend to keep it that way. Brendan sent a text. Hey man, epic move last night. Totally caught me off guard. Genius. We should talk. I've got some ideas for your hospitality group. Think you're leaving money on the table with your current model. The lack of self-awareness was so profound it was almost an art form. Ethan deleted the message without replying. But the real drama was playing out in the quiet apartment. One evening, about a week after the dinner, Chloe found Ethan in his home office, looking over a set of architectural plans. The symbolic object, his black moleskin, was on the desk beside him. I can't do this anymore, she said from the doorway. Ethan looked up, his face weary. Do what? This, the silence, the walking on eggshells. I feel like I'm living in a museum of our marriage. She walked into the room and stood before his desk. I have been so angry at you, at how you kept this enormous part of your life from me. It felt like a betrayal. I know, he said quietly, but I've also been doing a lot of thinking, she continued, her voice gaining strength, about why you did it and about why I reacted the way I did. For years, I've been trying to manage my family, trying to get them to like you. I thought I was building a bridge between my two worlds. She shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. But I wasn't building a bridge. I was just a traffic cop, directing the flow of toxicity, trying to prevent a crash. And I never once thought to just close the road. She looked him in the eyes, and for the first time in a week, he saw the woman he had fallen in love with. You didn't just reveal that you were rich, Ethan. You revealed that I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing them that I was willing to sacrifice your dignity. I was enabling them. And that's a bigger secret, a bigger betrayal than any of your bank accounts. It was a full and complete confession. She was finally seeing the true structure of the problem, the faulty foundation she had been standing on. Ethan stood up and walked around the desk to her. He took her hands in his. They felt cold. I was wrong too, Chloe, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I was so focused on my test, on my strategy, that I didn't see the impossible position I was putting you in. I should have trusted you. I should have told you everything from the beginning. We should have been a team. Instead, I made you an adversary in your own family. So what do we do now? She whispered, tears welling in her eyes again. But these were not tears of hurt or anger. They were tears of catharsis. Now, he said, pulling her into an embrace, we start building something new, together. But first, we need to do some demolition. The next day, Chloe called her parents. Ethan stood by her side, his hand on the small of her back, a silent, solid presence. Mom, Dad, she said into the phone, her voice clear and steady. Ethan and I need to take a break from seeing you, for a while. She could hear Eleanor's protests on the other end, the confusion, the indignation. But why, darling? We apologized. We want to make things right. No, Mom, Chloe said firmly. You want to make things right with Ethan's bank account. You haven't apologized to me. For the past 5 years, you have treated the man I love with disrespect and condescension. And for the past 5 years, I have let you. That's my fault. But it stops now. We will let you know when we are ready to talk again, if we're ever ready. Goodbye. She hung up the phone before they could reply. She did the same with Brendan, who was so shocked he could only sputter. The silence in the apartment afterward was not heavy or strained. It was light. It was clean. It was the silence of a space that has been cleared, ready for new construction. Chloe turned to Ethan, a real smile finally reaching her eyes. Okay, architect, she said. What do we build first? He smiled back, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. First, he said, we book a vacation. Someplace with no restaurants, no buildings, and definitely no Vances. The lesson was learned, the new dynamic was established. The most valuable asset they had was not his portfolio, but their partnership, and it was finally a joint venture. 3 months later, the city was draped in the golden hues of late autumn. The air was crisp, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Ethan and Chloe walked hand in hand through a park, fallen leaves crunching under their feet. They had taken that vacation, 2 weeks on a remote stretch of coastline, with nothing but a small cabin, a stack of books, and each other. They had talked for hours, excavating the past 5 years, laying bare all the unspoken resentments and hidden hurts. They had reforged their marriage on a new foundation of radical honesty. The break from her family had been hard on Chloe, but also liberating. She was rediscovering who she was without the constant, gravitational pull of their expectations. Her laughter was easier, her shoulders less tense. She had enrolled in a landscape design course, a passion she had long suppressed, and was finding a new joy in shaping the world around her, just as her husband did. Ethan, too, was changed. The burden of his secret had been heavier than he had admitted. Living a double life, even for what he had considered the right reasons, had taken its toll. Now there was an openness to him, a lightness. He shared details of his work with Chloe, not to impress her, but because he valued her opinion. He brought home sketches and plans, and they would discuss them for hours. She had a keen eye for aesthetics and human flow, and her insights were often surprisingly brilliant. He was no longer just the architect of buildings, they were becoming the architects of a shared life. As they sat on a park bench, watching the afternoon light filter through the thinning branches, Chloe's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Curious, she opened it. It was from Brendan. Chloe, I know you're not talking to us, but I need a favor. A big one. Dad's company is in trouble. He made some bad investments, tried to play catch-up, and got in over his head. The banks are calling in his loans. We're going to lose everything. I know Ethan is involved in the waterfront project. If he could just make a call, put in a good word, maybe help us secure a bridge loan, we're desperate. Chloe read the message out loud to Ethan. His expression remained neutral. He simply listened. A few months ago, this message would have sent Chloe into a spiral of anxiety and guilt. She would have felt the weight of her family's fate on her shoulders. She would have seen it as her duty to intercede, to plead their case with Ethan. Now she felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. Their arrogance had led them to this point. Richard, the great titan, had over-leveraged and lost. Brendan, the shark, was revealed to be a minnow in a dangerous sea. Their downfall was a direct consequence of the very hubris they had displayed at Aveline. It was a perfect and terrible poetic justice. "What are you going to do?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. He was not telling her what to do, or even suggesting it. He was leaving the choice entirely to her. This was the final test, not one he had designed, but one that life had presented. Chloe looked at the message on her phone. She thought of the years of small cuts, the constant feeling of being not good enough, the way they had tried to diminish the best person in her life. She thought of her father's bluster, her mother's snobbery, her brother's cruelty. Redemption, she knew, required genuine change, not just a desperate plea from the bottom of a hole they had dug themselves. She held her finger over the delete button. "I'm going to do what you should have let me do from the start," she said, looking at him with love and clarity. "I'm going to choose you. I'm going to choose us." She deleted the message without replying. She put her phone away in her purse. It was a small action, but it felt monumental. It was the closing of a door, the final demolition of a condemned structure. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "They need to learn that some things, once broken, can't be fixed by someone else's money." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. He looked out at the park, at the families and couples enjoying the beautiful day. He had spent years building an empire of property and wealth, all as a shield, a secret weapon. But sitting here, with his wife by his side, her trust and respect freely given, he realized he had finally acquired the only asset that had ever truly mattered. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the grass. The story of the disastrous birthday dinner at Aveline became a legend in their private history, a touchstone they would return to not with pain, but with a kind of wry wisdom. It was the night the old world had ended, and a new one had begun. It was the night Ethan had revealed his fortune, but it was also the night Chloe had discovered her strength. True worth, they had both learned, wasn't measured by what you owned, but by the integrity with which you lived and the respect you were willing to both give and demand. Their foundation was finally sound, built not on secrets and strategies, but on the solid ground of mutual admiration and unwavering partnership. And from that foundation, they knew they could build anything. And so, Ethan and Chloe began their new chapter, built on a foundation of truth. It makes you think, doesn't it? What is true wealth? Is it what's in your bank account? Or is it the strength of your character and the quality of your relationships? We've all known people like the Vances, who judge everything by its price tag, and maybe we've all felt a little like Ethan, quietly holding a truth that others can't see. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Have you ever been in a situation where you were completely misjudged? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories give life to this community. And if you found this story satisfying, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We believe in the power of stories to remind us of what truly matters, and there are many more to come. Thank you for watching, and remember to value the integrity in yourself and others. It's the one asset that never depreciates.